Hi, everybody. I unfortunately had forgotten to press record at the beginning of the lecture, so for those of you that couldn't be with us on live class, I've gone ahead and done this video recording so that you can become familiar with the topics that we discussed. And today we're going to be using the En-ROAD simulator as a way for us to think about how we might envision a decarbonized future on the planet. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with a brief presentation. So hopefully everyone can see this. And essentially what the idea behind the En-ROAD simulator is that it's a simulation game activity in which we can debate about climate action. And this game was actually tested at the last Conference of the Parties, or the last major IPCC meeting, where different governments and different groups came together to try to negotiate a decarbonized future. And so the goal for today's exercise is really to try to figure out strategies in which we can limit global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius, and to try to also keep warming to as close as 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And so the live class session actually was divided into different interest groups. One of those groups was conventional energy, of course, focusing on things like coal, oil, gas, nuclear energy, and electric utilities. Clean tech was another group, so really trying to think about alternatives to fossil fuels, energy storage, electric vehicles, energy efficiency, green buildings, and also thinking about carbon removal and also new energy technologies. Climate Justice Hawks was another group, and so you can really think about that as like the Sunrise Movement, for example. So these are leading environmental nonprofits, climate justice groups, grassroots and youth movements, and then citizens that are really starting to see the effects of climate change. And then the last group was looking at the idea from the perspective of world governments, and specifically we had a group that was looking at rapidly developing countries or rapidly industrializing companies like China and India. And so the project or the negotiation basically starts out with a set of plenary rounds in which each team looks at the En-ROAD simulator and tries to figure out a plan or a solution for decarbonizing based on their own interest groups. And so in that, they considered sort of the near-term benefit of the proposals, and then how you might address more than one of these actions. And then also trying to think about vulnerable communities and how to defray the effects of climate change equally among the world's citizens, especially for groups that were focused on environmental justice, grassroots environmental movements, and things like that. This is the simulator. The Moodle has the link to the website. And essentially, I encourage you to just sort of look at the different toggle switches and the levers and things like that, and experiment and see on your own if you can devise a way to think about how we might limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius through different kinds of actions in the energy, transport, and land and industry emissions sectors. So the process is essentially for us to break out, and these different groups set up in breakout sessions. They debated about different kinds of activities, and then they each gave 2-minute presentations. And I have a few of those recorded, so I was able to remember to press record for some of the last parts. And then we had a breakout session talking about sort of how different interest groups would have to compromise in order to get us to a decarbonized future that limits global warming. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and move to the simulator now. So this is the En-ROAD simulator, and it has quite a few sort of interesting features that I'd like to talk about. And so what we see here is that I just want to make sure that I've reset everything. So we have these 3 different sectors of energy supply, transport, and in land and industry emissions, and you can move them and toggle them back and forth. What they're showing here in these graphs is the one on the left is showing you the different sectors of energy production. And so something like red is oil, natural gas is blue, renewables is green, bioenergy is pink. New technologies are down here, so you might choose to like ramp up funding or development of new technologies. And then the black line over here is business as usual, and the blue line is the current scenario that will move based on the different kinds of activities that you choose. And so the other thing that you can do is you can change this to be something like CO2 emissions. That would maybe move more quickly if you say you subsidized the renewable energy sector and you taxed oil and gas and coal and oil, and you can see how that changes the carbon emissions substantially, right? But it isn't enough to get us where we need to be. Maybe we need to also think about starting to plant more trees, maybe ramping up carbon removal technologies like we talked about last week or last class section in terms of thinking about bolstering carbon sinks. So maybe we should also tax carbon. And you can see how these kinds of different kinds of activities or levers actually influence the outcome. You can also replay the changes and how they influence the different sectors. You can also reset this back to 0. And one of the things that I'll encourage you to do as you work through this on your own is to think about sort of what's going to happen if you change a lever. So we take, for example, the oil and gas industry. If we decide to start taxing it by moving this lever to the left, what do you think is going to happen? So you can predict that this will curb some carbon emissions, right? That red line is going to go down. So let's take a look. And it does go down. But what you also see is that that coal and natural gas actually go up. And so they, we also see that if we replay this, if you look at the green lever, at the green line, you do see an increase in, oh, now I'm replaying everything. So if we just reset everything and we look at what happens again if I move the oil lever back by starting to tax it, we see that renewables go up to take some of the burden of electricity or energy generation off, but then that coal and natural gas rise to accommodate that, and then net CO2 emissions really don't change that much. So it's a matter of like actually having to tax, oops, this is the descriptor, I'll show that in a minute, natural oil, all of the fossil fuels, and then that's really where you see a drop happen, and then you see this increase in other kinds of technologies. So the other thing that you can see is that if you click on the 3-dot button here, you can look at things like you could actually set the price of the carbon tax. You can also change like when it starts to roll out, and you'll see that that also influences the coal bar and how much is produced, right? And so we could see, like, for example, if it doesn't roll out till 2086, like you have this business as usual strategy, but then finally it drops off way, way, way late in the 21st century. So to get out of this, you can press close, and you can also set the carbon price, right? So that's just saying the price is high or very low. But you can also see that you could actually set it to like the current price for carbon, like $53 a ton, in some of those congressional proposals that are on the table for this year. The other thing you could do is also, if you, so this is the status quo, if you subsidize, that means give tax incentives to bioenergy production, you see how that also influences the total warming rate. So that's really the way the En-ROAD simulator works. The other thing that I showed people was that you can also look at these things called Kaya-graphs, and it shows you how some of these calculations are made within the context of the global population and also the GDP per capita, right? So essentially what we see here is that the global population, just like we determined in the population lecture, is increasing, and then it starts to level off at about 10 billion people, right? And that's what the models project is that our human population is going to level off at about 10 billion as we move out to the end of the century. The other thing we see is that the quality of life is improving, and so therefore GDP per capita is also increasing. We're getting more efficient at our energy use over time. And so what we see is like basically this final graph here is the accumulation of the global population, GDP per capita, energy intensity, and then carbon intensity of energy. And then, so what you see here is essentially a conglomerate of these different components that also go into the model. And what we see is that if we highly tax all of these fossil fuels, we can also see the net difference in gigatons of CO2 per year, right? So the population doesn't change, but we are changing, like, for example, the energy intensity, right? Because by focusing more on taxing the oil and gas industry, and then also, like, so for example, if we were to subsidize renewables, we can see how the intensity of the energy goes down. And so that means that it produces less CO2 emissions. So that's mostly just to sort of give you a chance to take a look at how this works. But then what I did was we assigned groups to these different stakeholder groups. And so, for example, the Climate Hawks were a group that includes a large established environmental organizations, youth-led movements, and they were really focused on limiting warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and as close to 1.5 as possible, trying to get 100% renewable energy as soon as possible, reducing deforestation, thinking about things that threaten global food production, so keeping that in mind, and land rights, and then lobbying other groups for strong climate action. Some of the other groups were, so clean tech, for example, was focused on including, this was a group of chief executives, investors, and policy experts and scientists in the industries for renewable energy, clean tech, carbon removal, and basically aimed at decarbonization. And so the idea is to make fossil fuels pay for their true cost through taxes and carbon pricing, subsidizing renewable energy, promoting efficiency and electrification in buildings and industry, and then also promoting the efficiency of the transportation system. Climate Hawks are these young people, I already went over that one, sorry. Emerging nations is sort of the idea that it's based on countries that are represented by countries like China and India that represent the world's largest and fastest growing developing nations. And so they comprise nearly 3.5 billion people of the 7.7 people worldwide. And they only generate about 25% of the economic output, right? Because there's a lot of poverty in those developing nations. So their goals or perspectives are to try to subsidize renewable energy, reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, reduce deforestation, think about afforestation or reforestation, and consider putting a price on carbon. And finally, the conventional energy group is, as you might imagine, they represent the coal, oil, and natural gas industry, nuclear and electric utility industries that supply most of our world's energy today. And they are wanting to they're wanting to oppose a high carbon price, oppose taxes on fossil fuels, promote new technologies, including carbon capture, carbon removal, and biofuels, and then encourage actions that won't directly affect their own industry. So I've also placed PDFs of these different stakeholder group descriptions, and then basically what the different groups did, everyone was randomly assigned, and then we came back and presented for 2 minutes each on their plans. The other Zoom video captures that, just a few of the groups presenting, and then we have a wrap-up session. So with that, thanks a lot for your time, and we'll see you next Tuesday.